If you have your Bibles, I'm going to ask you to turn to two passages of Scripture today. I'd like for you to turn to Luke chapter 16, and then also put a finger in Matthew chapter 6. Over the past few weeks, we've been investigating the topic of money, something that's obviously near and dear to all of our lives. But we've not been focusing on the 10% that God asks or commands us to give, depending on your view of tithing, which I believe that tithing is biblical. But we've been focusing on the 90% and how God expects us to manage what He has entrusted to us for His glory. In week one, we looked at the ownership principle. The ownership principle is very simple. God owns it all. God doesn't just own all of our resources. God owns us. God owns our talents, our abilities, everything about our lives. Every gift we have, it's because God gave it to us. And the Psalm says, the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. So everything about our lives, He has entrusted to us. And so when it comes to these financial resources, we looked at the parable of the talents. God has entrusted to us, and we are to be managers and stewards, and we're to manage these resources in such a way that it brings glory to God and it takes care of our earthly good. Then last week we looked at a second issue. We looked at the debt dilemma. We looked at the power and the influence of dragging debt through our lives. And if you remember, we had our little object lesson that if we are not careful, that debt can so overwhelm us that it can destroy our lives. It brings us to a breaking point. There's so much pressure. And we talked about last week how almost half of marriages that end in divorce end because of financial pressures. And so we've got to deal with the issue of debt. Even though the Bible doesn't say debt is sinful, it does say debt is not something that you need to hang around with or become friends with. Well, today we're going to look at the topic of saving and investing. And I'll be honest with you, Jesus has radical ideas about saving and investing. In fact, I would go so far as to say Jesus' ideas of saving and investing will challenge every single one of us, because we live in an American culture that, to be honest with you, does not teach the biblical principles of saving and investment, because it's all focused on us. And Jesus' concept of saving and investing focus on Him and His kingdom and His righteousness. And so there's going to be some things today that may be challenging to you. I hope you know that I'll be sharing these in love. I'm sharing them to help all of us so that we become faithful stewards of all that God's entrusted to us. Several years ago, I learned a valuable lesson on saving and investing. I was doing marriage counseling for two couples, premarital counseling for two couples simultaneous. And the first couple had $200,000 of joint income between the two of them, and yet they had zero savings and $75,000 of debt. The second couple, between the two of them, had $80,000 of income. But because they had learned how to manage their resources, because they planned for the future, when they got married, they had zero debt and $190,000 saved. Which one do you think had the easiest first year of marriage? Yeah, it's kind of obvious. Here's the reality. We all understand that money is a necessary evil. Money is something that makes the world go round. It's something that we need. But money is nothing more than a commodity. Money is something that it's a tool that we use to go through life. And the trick is not to fall in love with money, but to realize money is a tool, something that we can use. And the key to amassing wealth, the key to life when it comes to money, is not working for money, even though it's important to work for money. It's learning how to allow money to work for you. It's amazing how money can work for you if you'll let it. But there are some principles to guide us. I was reading this week and I learned something that I thought was interesting. America, 40% of the world's wealth is found within America. Did you know that? It's said that of that 40%, of all the world's wealth, 1% is owned by Americans. 40% of the world's wealth is owned by 1% of the people. Led by Bill Gates, 492 billionaires in the United States, with Bill Gates having a net worth of God only knows how much. What was staggering to me was there are 27.6 million millionaires in America. Now, I don't know if you fit in that camp. If you do, come see me. I'll tell you about the Joey Rogers Empty Pocket Fund, and you can help me out. No, but I was staggered, and yet most of us don't fit in that category. In fact, most of us, we're going, okay, I would like to have a little piece of that pie. But here's what I learned that I thought was interesting. If you have food in the fridge, clothes on your back, a roof over your head, and a bed to sleep in, you're wealthier than 75% of the people in this world. Amazing. If you have money in the bank, it doesn't matter how much. If you have spare change in a dish beside your bed at home, you are considered to be in the 8% of the wealthiest people in the world. Folks, whether we think God has blessed us or whether we just through our own human ingenuity as Americans, we are one blessed nation when it comes to finances. It's staggering. Now, here's what's sad to me, or here's what I struggled with. I read one article that said that back in 2010, that it was estimated that Christians, professing Christians, made about $6 trillion. And yet, when they pull it all back and they look at the giving, only about 2.7% of this $6 trillion by Christians was used for kingdom purposes. 2.7%. Now, if we do the math and you start looking at what Jesus had to say about money, I don't care if you believe in tithing, I don't care if you don't believe about tithing. The reality is, it all belongs to God. He asks us to make him first, and that we're to be generous to the things that involve kingdom issues. And yet, 2.7% of all that Christians say they make have been used for kingdom purposes. That's a problem. What does that say about our hearts? What does that say about what concerns us? Because we know what concerns God. Souls concern God. The reason he stepped out of heaven, came to this earth, was to die for people so that they could have a relationship with him. And everything about God and his plan and his purposes are about rescuing those who are lost and bringing them to himself. And he's chosen for some reason to use us in that process. He's chosen not just to use our mouths and our hands and our feet, but he's also chosen to use the blessings he's given us as stewards to perpetuate the work of the kingdom. And this is his heart. Now, with that said, let me just share a really cute story and then we'll move on. I read a great story about a mom who was absolutely hysterical because her son, her 3-year-old son, swallowed a quarter. First-time child, first oldest kid, he swallows a quarter. She is panicked. She is just freaking out. And the husband's sitting up there and just kind of twiddling his thumbs, gets out his cell phones, kind of punching around a number. She goes, "What are you doing?" She goes, "I'm calling the pastor." She goes, "We don't need the pastor. We need medical assistance. We need a doctor. We need EMS. Why are you calling the pastor?" He goes, "Because our pastor can get money out of anyone." I want to assure you this morning that my goal is not to get money out of you. My heart is to get all of us in a position where we understand biblical stewardship so that we can manage what God has given us in such a way that it brings honor and glory to him, and it also helps to take care of our good. So we're going to begin by looking at a parable that you've probably heard about, maybe even read, and you've gone kind of left scratching your head going, what in the world was he talking about? In Luke 16, we find the parable of the shrewd manager. In verse 1, we read this. Jesus told his disciples. So who is his audience? How many of you say the disciples? Well, you're kind of right. You'll find out in just a second. There was a rich man whose manager was accused of wasting his possessions. So he called to him and asked him, "What is this I hear about you? Give an account of your management, because you can't be a manager any longer." In other words, he just got fired. The manager said to himself, "What shall I do now? My master has taken away my job, but I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I know what I'll do, so that when I lose my job here, people will welcome me into their houses." So he called each one of his master's debtors, and he asked the first one, "How much do you owe my master?" 900 gallons of olive oil. He replied. The manager told him, "Take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 450. Then he said to the second man, "And how much do you owe?" 1,000 bushels of wheat. And he replied, he told him, "Take your bill and make it 800. The master then commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. Now, how many of you that surprises? It's kind of bizarre, isn't it? For the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of light. I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves, so that when you are gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. Jesus is not saying that you're to use money to get to heaven. Whoever can be trusted, now watch this, whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much. Whoever is dishonest with very little will also be dishonest with much. So if you haven't been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, who will trust you with true riches? Did you catch that? Jesus says true riches have nothing to do with monetary gain. It's not how much money you have that makes you truly wealthy. And then he says, and if you haven't been trustworthy with someone else's property, who will give you property of your own? No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate one and love the other, or you will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. Now, here's the rest of the story that we sometimes miss. Yes, Jesus was speaking to his disciples, but his audience was really the Pharisees who were eavesdropping in on the conversation. Then it says this. The Pharisees who loved money heard all this and were sneering at Jesus. And he said to them, "You are the ones who justify yourselves in the eyes of others, but God knows your heart. What people value highly is detestable in God's sight." It's detestable in God's sight. Now, I don't know about you, but I have learned from experience that if you don't manage your money will manage you. Have you learned that yet? I find that to be very true. But one thing that I learned as I'm studying this passage is that money is neither good nor bad. Money is a test. Did you catch that? Money is nothing more than a test as far as God is concerned. It's not a commodity. Yes, it's something we need, but God says, I've given all this to you to test you, to test your heart, to test your ability, to test to see what you're going to do with this stuff. Look back at verse 10 and 11. Whoever can be trusted with little can be trusted with much, but whoever is dishonest with a little will be dishonest with much. If you haven't been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, who will trust you with true riches? Did you see it? Did you see what happened? He says, if you are worthy of a few things, God will give you more. But if you're not able to handle it, why in the world would God give you more so that you could waste it? He wants us to be good stewards. And so in this parable of the shrewd manager, what you see or what you may not know is that this is a highly misunderstood text, but the point is very, very simple. It's not that God is applauding dishonesty, but rather he is using a clever crook to teach us a critical lesson. A lesson about money, a lesson about life. See, in this parable, Jesus is speaking to his disciples, but the Pharisees are listening in, and so he is going to say something to the Pharisees, kind of this indirect opportunity to teach a powerful lesson. And we saw that in verse 14 and 15. Now, here's the point. Here is the clear point of this parable. You ready? Jesus says, the concern and pursuit of earthly wealth for earthly purposes is detestable to him. Did you catch that? The pursuit and the desire for earthly wealth for earthly purposes makes God sick. That's a radical thought. Yes, he understands it makes the world go round. But God says to live in this earth, to amass things of this earth for earthly purposes, it's disgusting. Rather, what he's saying is, he expects us to use our earthly wealth, and he wants us to maximize our earthly wealth for eternal purposes. One commentator said it this way: the lost manager shrewdly took advantage of his opportunity to carefully work the situation to his advantage. And the owner applauded him for that. But Jesus' point is this: this man who represents the lost world was more skilled and diligent in securing his temporal future in the present age than most Christians are in securing their eternal reward in the age to come. Did you catch it? Jesus is saying, if you are a child of God, the very purpose you live is not for earthly things, it is for eternal things. That's why he says, set your minds on things above, not on things of the earth. Set your hearts on things above. That's the reason it says to fix our eyes on Jesus, who is the author and perfecter of our faith. We cannot get caught up in the things of this world because we are not citizens of this world. We're citizens of heaven. And so we should be living for eternal things. Now, to really understand this passage, we need to look at verse 18. In verse 18, he says, for the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than the people of light. What does this mean? Even though this man has different values than we have or should have as Christians, and that's important to understand. Someone who has made money their God, just because they've done that, doesn't mean that we don't have something to learn from them. In fact, what we learn is there are ways, honest ways, to manage and leverage money to grow it. We just can't get caught up pursuing those things for ourselves, but rather we're to grow it and manage it so that there's more to use for the kingdom. Remember this. Nothing in this world is more important than the kingdom of God. Nothing. And money is a commodity. And the issue here is not that money is evil, but that the love of money is the problem. If we love money more than we love God, we have a problem. And he makes it very clear. You can't love money and love God. You have to choose which one's going to be on the throne of your life. Now, if you remember, a couple weeks ago, we looked at the parable of the talents. And in that parable, one man gets 5 talents, one gets 2, and one gets 1. And the one who receives 5, what did he do with it? He doubled it. And the one who got 2, what did he do with it? He doubled it. But the one who got 1, he went and stuck it in the ground because of fearfulness. And I believe in that parable, there's a really important principle. Yes, we understand the whole issue of stewardship and ownership, but I think what Jesus was trying to teach alongside of those two principles is that God expects all of us to grow that which he's entrusted to us, but we're not to grow it for our lives, we're to grow it for the kingdom. And so if God has given you $100,000, He wants you to grow it to $200,000 or even more. But he doesn't want you to grow it so you can stick it in a bank account and sit back. Remember that parable of the guy who built all of his barns? He had all the stuff. He says, take life easy, eat, drink, be merry. He's saying, look, I don't want you to do it so that you can sit back and take it easy. He says, I want you to do it so you have more to contribute to the kingdom so that people can come to know me as Savior and Lord. That's his heart. And so when we get to this parable, the shrewd manager, Jesus, I think he's inferring that as Christians, we tend not to be very good at handling money from God's perspective. We might be great in handling money from the world's perspective. But if we think that having much in this life, if we do like that man in that parable and store it all up, remember that one line in that parable? It says, it doesn't matter how much you have if you're not rich towards God. And so he tells us we are stewards for kingdom purposes. And if we don't get that, then we've missed the point of why God has entrusted so much to us. Let me very quickly kind of go back through this parable. First, Jesus isn't commending this man for dishonesty. But what he does do is he gives us a picture of this man who, even though he's dishonest, he's a manager, he's a steward. And he does three things that are so profound that it causes the owner to step back and go, wow, you made some good decisions here. You were shrewd. You were smart. And I think those same three principles apply to us. See, the word that we have here in the Greek, phronimos, means to act wisely. To be not scheming, but certainly to be intentional in how you manage things. It's to handle things with insight. And so we see this guy do three things. First of all, he looked ahead. He looked ahead to the future. Look what it says in verse 3. The manager said to himself, what shall I do now? My master has taken away my job. I love this. I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm too ashamed to beg. This guy took his head out of the sand, and he realized reality is coming home to roost, and I have got a problem. He looked and said, I've got a real trouble. I'm too proud to beg, and I'm too weak to work, so I've got to figure something out fast. I got to figure out something really fast. He owned his reality. And I'm afraid that what happens to too many of us, especially Christians, is that we live for the here and now. And we do not have any sense of the reality of the future that's coming. Now, let me back up real quick. There's a fine line between preparing for the future with God and preparing for the future. And God never wants us to prepare for the future without him being the priority. Ever. Yesterday I was reading the USA Today. I don't know if any of you saw this article, but in yesterday's paper it said the top 5 problems Americans face today financially. Did any of you see that article? No, nobody reads the USA Today. In that article, it said that right now, 31% of the people surveyed said they have zero money saved for retirement. If they have an emergency, they have zero money set aside in an emergency account. What was really scary was 19% of these people are ages 55 to 64. They have zero money set aside for when they stop working. I think Jesus is trying to teach us that we need to look at the reality of the future and make plans for it, but make sure that we always include him in that plan. Let him lead that plan. A second thing he did in verse 4 is he says he planned ahead. So he looked ahead, then he planned ahead. He said, I know what I'll do when I lose my job here, so people will welcome me into their house. He didn't just look ahead, he planned ahead. And he devised a pretty nifty plan. Now, I don't suggest doing it with dishonesty, but I do think that we need to make realistic plans for our future. Now, here's where it's going to get a little delicate, especially in this audience over the next audience. You ready? Retirement is a cultural phenomenon in our society, but it is not a biblical concept. Retirement is a cultural phenomenon, but not a biblical concept. Let me say it a different way. You might retire from a job. You might retire from a paycheck, but you never retire from Jesus. See, when you are working, according to Colossians, when you're working, wherever your job is, that's your mission field. So whether you're working for a Fortune 500 company or whether you're working for a mom and pop shop, whether you're making $1 million a year or whether you're working for minimum wage, wherever you work is your mission field. And God has called you to be Him on that mission field. The paycheck is just a benefit. It's a perk as you serve your mission field. And yet, when we retire from getting a paycheck, it doesn't mean that we retire from serving Christ. It just means our mission field changes. And instead of someone else propping us up and supporting it, we're now self-funded. But the reality is we are still engaged in the mission of Christ. And we can never retire from that ministry, from that responsibility. I wrote this down and I penned this notes. Our plans, including our financial plans, need to do more than to take into account our financial security. They must include our sense of ministry calling. As long as we have breath in our lungs, as long as we have a heartbeat, God has a purpose for our lives. And that purpose is for His kingdom and His righteousness. There's a third thing this guy did. He didn't just look ahead, he didn't just plan ahead, but then he acted quickly. I love this because he looks at that verse, he says, how much do you owe? 800 gallons. He says, take your bill, sit down quickly. He understood that time was of the essence. He was making his plans. And so we need to be sure that when we sit down, we look ahead and we devise a plan, that we do so quickly as we're preparing for what God has in store for us next. And we always have to keep in mind that whatever He's entrusted to us is for His good and His glory and for our earthly care. But it's always first for His kingdom and His righteousness. That's a radical thought. In fact, I would dare say that many of you right now, there's a wrestling match going on in your head and in your heart going, I don't like this. I don't want to accept this. It doesn't matter whether you like it or whether I like it. This is what God has said about stewardship. This is what God has said about worldly wealth. We can either use it for His glory or we can use it for our glory and miss out on all that He has in store. Let me read a paragraph to you that I think is really important. As believers, we should be far more concerned and far more daring in preparing for eternal things than we are securing earthly things. It doesn't mean that we're to give away everything and live like paupers. Quite to the contrary. We're to live shrewdly in this life to maximize our wealth. Only we're not to live for earthly priorities. We're to live for eternal priorities. And we do this by releasing and investing the things that God has to us in matters of eternity. How can God use what He has blessed you with in this life to make an eternal difference? I want you to look at verse 9. I think this is a very important verse in this passage. He says, I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves, so when it is gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. Do you know what that means? It means that we're to use whatever God has given us so that when we step into eternity, there's going to be a crowd of people saying, thank you. Thank you. What you did, how you gave, how you managed earthly wealth for eternal purposes made a difference in my eternity. I read a really incredible story about this woman who was putting together a package to send to India. And there was this little girl that all she had was a penny. And she said, I want to give this penny. And they were like, you don't need to give that penny. Hold on to the penny. She said, no, I want to give this penny. It was all she had for kingdom purposes. It was said that that penny was used to buy a tract that was given to a Burmese chief who came to know Christ and then took what was given to him and he shared it with his tribe, and over 1,500 people came to know Christ because of her one little gift. Can you imagine what it's going to be like when that little girl gets to heaven and those 1,501 people applaud her because she used her earthly treasures for eternal purposes? Amazing. Just amazing. So let's now shift, because there's probably a great question that many of you have. How do I maximize my earthly possessions, my earthly treasures for eternal purposes? If you turn over to Matthew chapter 6, there are 4 tests that we see in this passage. And I want to kind of point them out to you very quickly. How do we maximize the earthly while we live for the eternal? In verse 19 it says, don't collect for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy, where thieves break in and steal, but collect for yourselves treasures in heaven where moth nor rust destroys, where thieves don't break in and steal. The word here, collect, is an interesting word. It literally means to stack horizontally. And so I'm stacking up these things, laying them out so that I can count them. He says, don't live to count your money. In other words, you got to know when to hold them, know when to fold them, know when to walk away. I cannot believe I just did that in a sermon. I'm sure it's going to haunt me one day, just like dancing in the second service last Sunday. Anyway, he says, don't live to count what you have. That's not the reason to live. Instead, he says, instead of investing in things that won't last, invest your life, invest your treasures into things that will last for eternity. Let me ask you a question. What is the one thing that you and I can take to heaven? Anybody? The soul of another person. You've all heard it. You will not find a hearse pulling a U-Haul. The only thing that will pass from this life into eternity is the soul of another man. And Jesus says, don't live for the things of this earth that are going to burn, rust, or fade away. Instead, live for that which has eternal purposes. Let me give you a practical point when it comes to investing, because we do have this responsibility to maximize our wealth, and it's very simple. I believe that we as Christians should never support a cause to profit ourselves that would neither glorify God nor gain his approval. So if you're making an investment, you should not make an investment off of sinful behavior. Your investment should be on things that would put a smile on God's face. And so as you make investments, whether it's in the stock market, whether it's in mutual funds, whether it's buying property, you name it, However you're trying to maximize your wealth, it should be done in a way that honors God. Make sense? The second thing is the heart test. The first was the heaven test. The second is the heart test. In verse 21, it says, "For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." This is a question of who gets the credit, who gets the glory. The first one, the heaven test, is really, will it last, will it matter? This one is it about me or is it about God? Who is going to get the credit? Who's going to get the honor? And simply put, where you invest your resources tattletales on who really sits on the throne of your life. And so if you're investing in things that it's all about you, then it's about you. Let's just own up to it. I am sitting on the throne of my life. This is my throne. I'm sitting on it, and I'm saying, I'm going to take care of me. I'm going to be my own God. That's really the question here. Where your heart is, there your treasure's going to be. If my heart's fixed on Christ, and He's on the throne of my life, then everything that I have goes through His fingers before it goes anywhere. And so there's a challenge here that we should make sure that we are not just investing in things that will last, but we're investing in things that will honor God. The third thing is the human test. This is a very interesting. He comes up and says, the eye is the lamp of the body. If your eye is good, everybody circle the word good. If your eye is good, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, circle the word bad. Your whole body will be full of darkness. So if the light within you is darkness, how deep is that darkness? This verse speaks to the way that we look at and use money. And here's what it concludes. How we view money is a barometer of the condition of our heart. How we view money is a condition of our heart. Now here's what's interesting. The word lamp simply means lens. I'm wearing glasses here. If I take these glasses off, I can see all of you. I just can't see 6 inches in front of me. And so when I put these on, I have a lens that brings things into focus. In the same way, how we manage resources brings into focus the condition of our heart. It brings into focus what's important to us. And here's what he says, I think is really quite interesting. He says that the eye is good. The Greek word is H-A-P-L-O-U-S, haplos. That word means generous. Not good as in a moral code. It means if I am generous. The second word, bad, is poneros, which means stingy. So really the way this verse ought to read is the eye is the lamp of the body. If your eye is generous, the whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is stingy, your whole body will be full of darkness. And so what's happening is we're being tested. And what's being asked, am I generous with what God has given me, or am I holding on to what God has given me, and I have no concept of why God has entrusted the resources He has entrusted to me? It's a very interesting perspective here. And he says basically, if you're eaten up with greed, that's not a sign of being saved, that's a sign of lostness. Did you catch that? If God gives me something and I hold on to it and I will not release it for kingdom purposes, that's not indicative of someone who's saved. But if I am generous with what God has given to me, that is a great indication that I am walking with God and I'm trusting God with all my heart. Then there's one last test. He says, no one can be a slave of two masters. Same phrase used in Luke 16. Either he'll hate one and love the other, be devoted to one and despise the other. You can't serve God and money. There's not one single aspect of our life where we should ever stray away from God's heart or His will. And yet, money is always the biggest piece of bait that the enemy uses to pull us away from God's heart and God's will. And so Jesus just kind of draws a line. He says, folks, it's really simple. Well, I'll do it this way. He draws a line. He says, if you're on this side and you say, God, it all belongs to you, I trust you with it, and I'm going to be a steward of it, or money's my God. But there is no meeting place in the middle. It is a fine line. Either God or money serves as the motivating factor of your life. And God says nothing should ever come before him and you. Okay. So that is the issue, and it's also how we're to address it. So let me give you very quickly 6 principles that if we put into place, that we can manage our resources in such a way that brings glory to God. These are very quick and very practical. Number 1, we have to accept God owns it all and that we own nothing. We have to actually embrace it. We have to do more than give lip service to it. We actually have to believe it. God owns it all. I'm a steward. Second, we need to make our priority giving to support eternal causes. We need to realize that God has given these things to us, and so we're to use them to make an eternal difference. We're to use our resources to make sure the gospel is proclaimed. Whether we go with it or not, we're responsible for making sure the gospel is proclaimed. Third, it's very important if you're going to do this that you strive to live debt-free. Debt are shackles that inhibit us from doing things. One person said it this way: when we become a slave to the lender, we become a victim instead of a victor. Debt inhibits our ability to go and to support kingdom purposes. I can't tell you how many times I've heard someone say, I believe God has called me to go, but I can't because of all these bills. I've heard missionaries say, or people who were called to mission say, I believe God's called me to go to this mission field, but I can't go because of my debt. Debt is a dead weight that we drag around, and so to live debt-free enables us. Fourth, don't use your resources simply to live for today. We need to create margin, not just time in our lives. We need to create margin in our budgets so that we have the ability to respond to God when he calls. Fifth, save so you're free to give and to go. I could preach an entire sermon on this, but I'll tell you what I love, and it blesses me every time I see it, is when I see someone who gets to the point of their life that they're not dependent upon someone to give them a paycheck. They are self-funded, but because they've kept Jesus on the throne and because they've applied those other principles to their life, when God calls, they're able to go. When God says, hey, I would like for you to send this other person, they say, all right, I will send them. I will help send them. But they're free to do that because they've created margin throughout their lives so that they can give to kingdom purposes. And then the last thing, leave your assets to be used for God's glory. Another thing we could preach an entire sermon on. Most of us have children, grandchildren that are waiting for us to kick the bucket so that they can inherit something. Now, I'm not saying it's a bad thing to leave. I know that in my case, I'm worth a whole lot more dead than I am alive. I'll just be honest with you. Because I have to provide for my 11-year-old son, whether I'm here or not, for the rest of his life. And for all I know, he could live to be 100 years old. And so I have to make plans for him, should I kick the bucket. But I think what God is saying, and I think the principle here, is that I'm to live this life within my means, creating margin so I have freedom to go. But also, when it's time for me to go to heaven, that which is left over, I need to leave enough to take care of my family. But I also need to take that which is beyond that scope, and I need to put it towards kingdom things so that the work of God is important. So instead of leaving an inheritance, let's leave a legacy. Let's leave a spiritual legacy. All right, so let me close. I read this great story. You may have heard the story. I read a story about a man who died and went to heaven, and he was met at the pearly gates by St. Pete. And, he was all excited. He said, hey, I can't wait. God gave me so much on the earth, and I was so blessed. I can't wait to see my mansion in heaven. And so as they're walking down the street, he comes to this first mansion, and it's just gorgeous, huge mansion. He's like, is that mine? He goes, no, that's your janitor's. He was a godly man. He loved God. He served God faithfully. And so that was his mansion. He goes, oh. They keep walking. He says, is that my mansion? He goes, oh, no. That's your maid's mansion. She raised 6 kids, and she on minimum wage that you paid her, and she just did amazing things and raised her children in the admonition of the Lord, and that's her mansion. He goes, well, where's my mansion? And so he goes, okay, come with me. And they go down this winding path, and next thing you know, there's this shack that has held together with baling wire, and it's got a cardboard front door. And St. Peter goes, there you go. He goes, oh, there's got to be, I got to go see God. There's got to be some mistake. That cannot be my mansion. And Pete looks at him and goes, you know what? That's all we could do with what you sent ahead. Let me just make it simple. I'm going to ask you a question. Are you a child of God? Do you know that if you were to die this very second, you would spend eternity with the Father? If your answer to that question is yes, then based on the authority of God's word, he says, then you should be living for eternal purposes, not for earthly purposes. And one day, we're all going to stand before the Father at this bema seat. And God's going to look at how we stewarded our lives, not just with wealth, but with everything he's given us. And I'll tell you what he wants to say. He wants to say, well done, thou good and faithful servant. Do you know who gets to decide whether he's going to say that about you? You. Are you living for the eternal, or are you living for the earthly? Thank you, Father.